Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What would Angela Davis do? Let's get to the bottom line. My guest today is someone who is talking about fighting racism and defunding the police when it was considered way too radical. She became a folk hero in the 1970s for standing up to the establishment in almost every way you can imagine. She got fired from her teaching job at the University of California for being, quote unquote, too outspoken. When she was once thrown in jail, a movement of blacks and whites took to the street in protest until she was freed. Musicians like the Rolling Stones and John Lennon and Yoko Ono wrote songs about her, and all that was before she was 30 years old. This year, Time magazine chose her as one of the women of the century. And even nowadays, a t-shirt with her image on it, made by Prada, goes for $300. She is the one and only Angela Davis, scholar, activist, and author of several books, most recently, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. And she joins us today from her home in Oakland, California. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us here. I want to start with, right now, we have almost Back to the Future. We have protests in the street. We had killing of black men and women in the country that have yet again raised this question of police brutality and really the social contract that we have across race and class in this country. You've been through all of this before. What are your views of how this is shaping out now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And let me say that this is a very exciting moment. It's an extraordinary conjuncture. And I see this moment as reflecting work that has been done over decades and even over centuries. Finally, after decades of arguing that we need a conversation about race and racism in this country, it is on everyone's agenda. And I think what's so exciting about this moment is that we are recognizing that racism is indeed institutional and structural. It is embedded in the very fabric of this country. And we're trying to figure out ways to begin to initiate the process of eliminating that racism. One of the things I think that is very exciting about this moment is the feminist consciousness. And of course, the last major mobilizations we saw in this country and all over the world happened around the time of the inauguration of the president, the current person who I don't really like to call him the president. I'll say the person who occupies the office of the presidency. And they were the women's marches. Women's marches took place in every city and town in this country and all over the world. And so I see this current moment as reflective not only of the anti-racist consciousness that is developing, but also reflective of the feminist consciousness.
But we've seen these moments fade away and nothing happened before. What do you want to see where you know that the protests that we're seeing will actually equate to something more than just an emotional moment?
Well, I think many people in this country would like to see serious institutional change, structural change. The demand to defund the police department is not simply a demand to reform the police, not to make the police better, not to get rid of the so-called bad apples, not to stop with that, but to ask more profound questions. What is the nature of public safety? What does security mean? And to thus develop answers that go far beyond the current assumption that violence, institutional violence, is the only way to guarantee public safety. I think people are beginning to realize that we have to address health issues, mental health issues especially. The police are not equipped to address many of the problems that they are called upon to address because we've never actually decided what kind of society we want to live in, and how we can make our neighborhoods and our families secure. And so it's such an exciting moment. But of
Mm,
course, the real work happens after the dramatic demonstrations, the protests. And I don't want to minimize the impact of these amazing gatherings that have happened everywhere in the world in response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and
mm,
Rayshard Brooks and others. Um, what we're going to have to do is to take each institution, schools, for example,
mm,
the demand to get cops out of schools is so important because schools are, especially schools in Black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of other communities of color, have begun to replicate the environment of police
mm.
stations and prisons. So this is the beginning, I'm hoping, of a long process of self-examination and transformation of the institutions that constitute the society. And let me say
Well,
finally,
mm,
well, I just want to talk about the importance of understanding the impact of capitalism, global
mm,
capitalism, because that is often the elephant in the room that isn't discussed, that is largely responsible for the perpetual, seemingly perpetual existence of racism. Capitalism is racial capitalism, and I think we need to confront that today and move in the direction of envisioning and hopefully eventually building a society, a socialist society.
when with the president you won't name, but President Trump, when he tells the Black community, "Hey, it can't get worse. Try me out," like he did in the last election. How, when you hear those words and you look at the inequality in this country, you look at the racial divides in this country, which people are protesting about now. When you hear Trump say these things, how do you think, how would you convey to non-Black audiences how deeply that sears into the souls of folks?
Well, I find it difficult to respond to anything he says. It is, um, the only thing I can say is that there's a coming election, and we have to guarantee that if not compelled to resign before, that we get
Mm,
him out of office. That has to be central to the agenda of beginning the process of rooting out racism in this country. I can't even dignify the statements that he makes by responding to them. They are so absurd and
mm.
ridiculous, and they reflect an era that I experienced 50 years ago, 75 years ago. Yeah, this person has got to go.
So, Dr. Davis, you have written a lot about prisons and police, whatnot, replicating the characteristics of slavery. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, actually, I would phrase it somewhat differently. I don't think that jails and prisons and police formations are simply analogous to slavery. It's not a relationship of analogy,
Mm,
but rather it's a historical relationship. It's one might say, a genealogical relationship. There is
mm,
if one looks at the um, evolution of police practices and the impact that the early slave catchers eventually had on the formations, police formations, if one looks at what happened in the immediate aftermath of the so-called abolition of slavery, one sees a relationship between law enforcement, official law enforcement, and white supremacist formations like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, etc.
mm,
And when one looks at what continues to happen, the murders of Black people by largely by white police, one can almost feel that connection with white supremacy and Ku Klux Klan. And we know in many police departments across the country, white nationalism is a major influence. So, there are ways in which we can think about understanding our history, and one of those ways consists in recognizing that history is never put to bed. History is always a powerful presence. History, the ghosts of the past are always with us. And so now what we're trying to do is work that actually should have been done in the aftermath of slavery. We're 150 years too late. We're doing what we should have done in the late 1800s.
What is your counsel and advice to this new generation of people who've now found activism as part of their cause today?
First of all, I find it really exciting that there are so many powerful, intelligent, young Black people and other people of color and young people in general who really want to change the world, who really want to guarantee that tomorrow is different. I try not to be the person who hands out advice because it's often assumed that those of us who have lived as long as we have lived have all of the knowledge and the wisdom. And of course, we have the experience, and a certain measure of wisdom emanates from that experience. But it's young people.
You made choices. I mean, one of them, for instance, is you didn't leave this country. Many of your colleagues, many of the people you were with, went to other places in the world because they were disgusted by what they saw in the United States. You didn't leave. It'd be interesting to know why you didn't leave. Because I think people do face. I mean, I think these people are on the line. They're putting themselves on the line, and they may face similar hard choices. It's not easy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. As a matter of fact, I've traveled a great deal, and I always insist on framing our domestic issues as global issues, as international issues. And of course, I thought about going into exile when I was younger and when I was targeted by the FBI. And ultimately, I decided that I didn't want to find myself in a situation where I would never be able to return home. And this is home. And so it was clear to me that at that time, a winning strategy might be to simply stay underground as the movement was organized and as the mass support and solidarity was generated, so that when I did turn myself in, and I actually ended up being captured by the FBI rather than deciding when I would turn myself in. But there was an enormous global movement calling for my freedom. And that is why we were able to win. So I always look at mass movements as the answer, bringing people together, uniting people across borders that often divide them. Recognizing, for example, in this country, that as we look at the reverberations of the horrendous murder of George Floyd, we also have to think about Adama Traore in Paris. This is a case that has been central to the struggles against racism in Paris. We have to think about Marielle Franco, who was
Mm.
assassinated by former law enforcement in Brazil. So I don't see being involved in local work as at all being in opposition to addressing global issues.
Do you at this moment trust the US electoral system and people's engagement in it to deliver a different future?
No, absolutely not. Um, and I have many critiques of course, of the Republican Party, and particularly given its turn toward white nationalism and racism and misogyny.
Mm.
But I think the Democratic Party is also very problematic, especially in its connection with global capitalism, corporate capitalism. And I don't think we can assume that any candidate from that party, much less the one who is running now, will lead us in the kind of radical direction I think we should be moving in.
So what would that
However,
what mm, mm,
let me just say this. I am
yeah.
not
Mhm.
saying that it is not important to vote, because it
Mm.
is absolutely essential to vote. And it is through the electoral process that we will oust the existing president. But let me say that,
Mm.
even though, as I've said many, many times, that the electoral arena is not the best space to express radical politics. We can use the electoral arena to guarantee that we continue to have the space, or that we increase the existing space for the expression of radical politics.
Mm.
So I'm asking people to vote for ourselves, to vote for themselves, to vote for the possibility of continuing the organizing and mass
Mm.
expressions of, 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 of radical approaches, of abolition, of abolition feminism, because we have to, connect the degree to which violence coming from the state violence, is connected to intimate violence as well, and gender violence,
Mm.
which is indeed the most pandemic form of violence in the world.
Dr. Davis, you have now, I think, been re-awarded the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute Human Rights Award for your work on civil rights broadly, but it was withheld or taken back at one point because you were so outspoken about Palestinian rights. Indeed, your last book links Ferguson, Missouri, and the tragedies and the protests there to Palestinian rights. How do you see the frame of that, and why are these linked? And congratulations on the award.
Thank you. Um, well, the issue, of course, was the failure to recognize that one cannot discriminate when it comes to human rights. It's a human rights award. And when it was initially rescinded after having been offered to me, the explanation had to do with my work around Palestine and my
Mm.
opposition to the occupation of Palestine, my work with BDS. Um, and of course, one cannot suggest that certain people or certain populations deserve to be acknowledged as recipients of human rights and others are not. That was the main issue. Now, of course, after many, many months and months of conversation and discussion and reorganizing, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which has been completely restructured in terms of its leadership, has offered me the Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award once more, and I'm happy. I was happy to receive it because of the fact that it represents the extent to which institutions like that can change. can begin to effectively work with the community. And of course, the community in Birmingham, the Black community in Birmingham, but even members of the Jewish community in Birmingham rose up and and said no to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. The mayor was critical of the decision to rescind the award. Whereas initially I was very shocked and upset that this happened. I later recognized that this was a teachable moment, that this was very important because enormous numbers of people began to reflect on the ways in which Palestinians have been marginalized in this struggle. Many Jewish people whom I know have come up to me and argued that that was the moment when they began to realize that they could not assume that the state of Israel represents justice for human beings, and so I'm really exciting. I'm really excited that we've seen some changes happen. I think we should also bring Israel and Palestine into the current conversation, precisely because Israel, the Israeli army, has been training U.S. police departments in small towns and large cities, training them in counterinsurgency. They have been participating in the process of militarizing law enforcement in this country, and Palestinians are the best allies and supporters of the Black struggle in this country, and this has been true over time. Many Palestinian political prisoners supported me when I was in jail, and so that has a long history as well.
Let me just ask you finally, and I really appreciate your candor in this discussion, but you've had a lifetime of challenging the establishment and helping other people to see a different way. I'd like you to speak to the young men and women that haven't gone through that life yet and they're making choices. What do you think they should know that may help them in the kind of institutional changes that you think we may be ready to make now?
Well, first of all, I would urge young people to recognize that the work that they do really matters, even though it might appear as if there are no consequences to the organizing that they do that is so frequently not acknowledged in well, in the media, perhaps sometimes in social media it is, but the fact that the work does matter and it will eventually bear fruits. And as you pointed out, I've been involved in these struggles since the 1960s, the 1970s, and I don't know whether I ever expected to experience a moment like this. But what I do know is that if we had not done the work, year after year, decade after decade, we would not be where we are today. And I think young people, in keeping their vision on the future, should also recognize that the work that they're doing now that appears not to resonate with a great deal of people. I know that there are efforts to bring the issue of violence against trans people, and especially Black trans women, into the movement. And that's not been nearly as successful as the effort to shine the light on the murders of Black men. And of course, the feminist consciousness, as we see, women are behind this massive upsurge. They've been doing the organizing. They're most often at the forefront of organizations, and so I would suggest that they think also about the long range impact of the work that they're doing today.
Well, I have talked to many people about these issues, and I think that if this is a moment when there is change, almost everyone I have talked to has referenced back to your life and experiences, your jail time, the protests, and you're not giving up. So what a privilege it is to talk to you today, Dr. Angela Davis. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you very much for having me.
So what's the bottom line? Derek Bell was the first Black American to become a professor of law at Harvard University in 1971. And he once said, "We have made progress in everything, yet nothing has changed." Perhaps it's the fearlessness and the vision of how society could be, planted long ago by people like Angela Davis, that are making today's conversations and protests matter now more than they ever have before. Maybe this time we'll get real change. And that's the bottom line.